The meth that started a war. How a tiny pill turned Nazis into machines. In late 1930s Germany, just before the world erupted into war, a pharmaceutical company called WWII was working on a breakthrough drug. In 1937, they released a small white tablet named Pervitin. It looked innocent enough, a little over-the-counter pill sold in pharmacies without any prescription. But inside that tablet was something dangerously potent. Methamphetamine hydrochloride. This was legal crystal meth, though meth had been first synthesized in Japan back in 1893 and transformed into a tablet form by the 1910s. It was Temmler's version, Pervitin, that exploded in popularity. In Germany, it was advertised as a miracle pep pill. The promises were bold: boundless energy, intense focus, unstoppable confidence, and even effortless weight loss. Ordinary Germans, students, factory workers, housewives, began using it to push through workdays, study for hours, or simply feel better. It was so accessible that you could walk into any German pharmacy and grab a pack off the shelf. And soon it wasn't just civilians popping pills. The Nazi military noticed. They saw what Pervitin could do. It made people stay awake for hours, feel no hunger, eliminate fear, and tolerate extreme stress without breaking. The army began experimenting, wondering what would happen if entire battalions of soldiers were turned into sleepless, fearless war machines. They got their answer. Soldiers who took Pervitin became different. They marched without resting. They fought without food. They didn't panic under pressure. They didn't hesitate or collapse. It was like flipping a switch. Ordinary men transformed into relentless, unbreakable machines. The military was stunned. In 1939, the Nazi High Command officially approved Pervitin for mass military use. Temmler was ordered to scale up production immediately, and within months, the pill was being distributed during training, deployments, and active missions. Military doctors believed it was the perfect performance enhancer. In fact, official medical papers were published in Nazi journals praising the drug's ability to boost fighting spirit and risk tolerance. By April 1940, as Germany prepared for its invasion of France, Pervitin was no longer just a supplement. It was part of the strategy. Military pharmacists distributed 35 million tablets for the France campaign alone. Soldiers were instructed to take 2 or 3 pills at a time and could then operate for 2 to 3 days without sleep. Some marched over 50 kilometers straight. Tank drivers rolled through enemy territory all night with zero fatigue. Pilots flew bombing missions wired on meth, eyes wide, nerves deadened, minds laser-focused. One German army doctor said it outright: "Our secret weapon isn't a tank, it's a pill." It was portable, cheap, lightning fast. Soon, soldiers started calling it Stuka-Tabletten, after the terrifying dive bombers, or Go pills. Others nicknamed it Panzer Schokolade, tank chocolate, because it was sometimes melted into candy bars to make it easier to consume during missions. At the heart of this new chemical warfare was a brutal high-speed assault strategy called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The plan was simple but savage: strike hard, strike fast, overwhelm the enemy before they could blink. Planes, tanks, and troops all surged forward together, shock and awe in pure form. But Blitzkrieg needed something unusual: soldiers who didn't sleep, who didn't flinch, who could push through exhaustion, hunger, cold, and chaos without slowing down. Pervitin made that possible. And as the army prepared to storm through the Ardennes, a place the French believed was impassable, those pills would fuel one of the most shocking attacks the world had ever seen. The Nazi war machine was now chemically enhanced. Soldiers didn't just train harder or move faster. They were transformed into something mechanical. Fueled by Pervitin, they stopped acting like humans. They became tools of destruction. Tank crews popped pills before every deployment, staying awake for 3 to 4 days straight. They navigated massive armored vehicles across rough terrain without rest, their minds locked into hyperfocus. Up in the air, Luftwaffe pilots, especially bomber crews, were doing the same. They flew missions across Europe on no sleep, dropped bombs, and flew back without blinking. Meth made them invincible. On the ground, the madness was just as intense. Infantry soldiers marched for over 36 hours without stopping, carrying heavy gear through dense forests, freezing snow, or mud-filled roads. And they didn't just march, they fought. Some units advanced more than 80 kilometers in 2 days, smashing through resistance like machines. These weren't ordinary soldiers anymore. They were high on meth, and it was working. One of the most dramatic examples came in May 1940, during the Nazi push through the Ardennes forest. The terrain was supposed to be impossible for tanks. The French believed no army could pass through it in large numbers. But the Nazis didn't just pass through. They shattered expectations. Fueled by Pervitin, German forces broke through the Ardennes in record time, stunning British and French troops who never saw it coming. Many of those soldiers hadn't slept. For days, their bodies should have given out. Instead, they kept moving. Orders were issued to provide at least 2 Pervitin tablets per day per soldier, and in combat, even more if needed. Commanders carried the pills like ammunition. The plan was working, but it had a dark side, because what went up had to come down. After the high wore off, the crashes were catastrophic. Soldiers suddenly felt dizzy, weak, and paranoid. Some collapsed right in the middle of combat. Others began hallucinating, convinced they were being hunted or surrounded by enemies that didn't exist. Entire squads had to be pulled from the front lines because the crash hit them all at once. There were terrifying cases of mental breakdowns, men shaking, screaming, or refusing to follow orders. Some believed invisible enemies were attacking them. Others curled into corners, covering their ears, convinced voices were whispering to them. Military doctors began filing reports. They warned of rising addiction, cases of psychosis, and emotional collapse. Some soldiers became erratic. Others turned violent without reason. But the leadership didn't stop the drug. Because it worked, meth didn't just give Nazi troops energy. It stripped them of fear, hunger, empathy, and even sanity. What remained was a weapon in human form. They could march further, kill faster, obey blindly. And as the war escalated, so did the drug use. But the most terrifying impact wasn't just on the battlefield. It was still waiting. In the SS, in the camps, and in the darkest corners of Nazi horror, where meth turned cruelty into something far worse. If methamphetamine turned Nazi soldiers into machines, it turned the SS into something even darker. Merciless executioners with no tether to reality. The Schutzstaffel, or SS, wasn't just a military unit. It was an elite, fanatical force handpicked for blind loyalty to Hitler. These were the men who carried out the final solution. They ran the concentration camps, enforced racial policy, and formed the backbone of Nazi terror. And many of them were addicted to drugs, not just meth, but powerful opioids like morphine. The combination was devastating. Methamphetamine made them alert, aggressive, and emotionless. Morphine dulled whatever guilt might have remained. Together, these drugs created killers who didn't blink. The SS didn't just use drugs in battle. They used them to erase human empathy. Some Nazi doctors believed that these substances were essential to keep men cold-blooded, to remove hesitation, fear, and conscience. Others didn't care about the psychological cost. They cared only about the results. Inside death camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek, meth wasn't just used on guards. It became a tool of medical torture. Doctors like Karl Klauberg and Eduard Wirths began conducting experiments that pushed prisoners beyond human limits. In Auschwitz, Dachau, and Sachsenhausen, victims were injected with methamphetamine to study how long a person could survive without food or sleep. Some were forced to stay awake for days while performing labor until their hearts stopped. Others were starved to death while kept wired on meth to see how long their bodies would resist collapse. One horrific experiment in Dachau involved freezing prisoners alive to test endurance. Meth was administered to see if it prolonged survival. It didn't. The results were death, painful, prolonged, and silent. SS guards themselves were breaking down. Many were so deep into their own drug addiction they lost contact with reality. Some guards reported hearing whispers in their heads. Others hallucinated entire attacks that never happened. At Majdanek, one SS officer opened fire on a group of prisoners, convinced they were speaking to him telepathically. They weren't saying a word. It was the meth talking to his brain. Another guard was seen shaking uncontrollably, then suddenly snapped. He beat a prisoner to death with his bare hands. Witnesses described him as foaming at the mouth, a man gripped by a violent drug-induced psychotic episode. By 1943, even the Nazi leadership couldn't ignore what was happening. Internal reports began surfacing, describing SS officers as unstable, erratic, and in many cases, clinically insane. They were no longer just following orders. They were creating their own twisted versions of terror, lashing out in personalized violence born of paranoia and addiction. But it was too late. These men were hooked. The damage was done. And the deeper they sank, the more uncontrollable the Nazi regime became. Because meth didn't just create soldiers, it created monsters. And at the heart of that transformation was a system that used drugs not to heal, but to destroy. And soon the drugs would reach the very top of Nazi command, to Adolf Hitler himself. By the time the Nazi war machine began to crack, the poison wasn't just running through the veins of its soldiers. It was running through Adolf Hitler himself. What many people still don't know is that Hitler wasn't only feeding drugs to his army, he was deeply addicted, and not occasionally. This was daily, precise, and intensely personal. The man trusted with this job wasn't a general or a scientist, but a man in a white coat, Dr. Theodor Morell, Hitler's private physician. Morell wasn't viewed highly by Hitler's inner circle. Some of them even saw him as a fraud, a quack, a walking pharmacy. But Hitler? He trusted Morell absolutely. If Hitler had a headache, stomach cramps, insomnia, or even mild fatigue, Morell had a solution, a syringe filled with something powerful. Between 1941 and 1945, Hitler received over 80 different kinds of drugs. Some were basic supplements, but most were not. They were potent, mind-altering substances, including regular injections of methamphetamine. Yes, the same meth his troops were using in battle was now being pumped into the most powerful man in Germany. Morell didn't stop there. Hitler's daily drug regimen included Eucadol, a synthetic opioid similar to oxycodone, Pervitin or methamphetamine for energy and focus, cocaine-based nasal drops and throat treatments, caffeine glucose, shots for stimulation during the day, barbiturates to sedate him at night. Even bull semen extract, which Morell claimed would boost his stamina. It sounds insane, because it was. But the records are real. By 1944, the drugs were clearly tearing Hitler apart. In newsreels and footage from that time, he looks like a man possessed. His left hand shakes constantly. In one clip, he desperately tries to hide the tremor behind his back. His skin looks pale, waxy. His eyes twitch. His body is stiff and frail. But it wasn't just physical. His speech patterns changed. Sometimes he would talk too fast, other times too slow. His moods flipped wildly, calm one moment, screaming the next. He accused loyal staff of betrayal. He dismissed his generals. He refused to believe facts. And he began fantasizing about secret weapons and miracle victories, even as Germany crumbled around him. Many of his close associates began to whisper, "This isn't the same man who once took Europe by storm." His decisions didn't make sense. His paranoia was out of control. He would spend most of his time locked away in the Führer bunker, isolated, twitching, and still getting injections from Morell several times a day. By early 1945, Hitler was likely completely dependent on his chemical cocktail. His teeth were rotting. His digestive system was failing. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His skin was clammy and pale. He was plagued by insomnia and stomach cramps. The Führer, who once envisioned a 1,000-year empire, could barely walk without assistance. And yet, in his underground bunker, surrounded by yes-men and shadows, he continued to give orders. Orders that made no military sense. Orders rooted in delusion and fantasy, not strategy. The empire was falling, but Hitler couldn't see it. Not through the haze of drugs, not through the paranoia, and when he finally took his own life on April 30th, 1945, he wasn't just defeated, He was physically and mentally destroyed. The war had ended, but the true collapse had begun long before, with a needle, a pill, and a man who thought drugs could hold back reality. By the final year of the war, Nazi Germany was imploding. The once mighty engine of conquest had become a hollow shell, driven not by strategy or strength, but by lies, delusion, and drugs. The streets of Berlin were crumbling. German civilians were starving, freezing, terrified. Cities were bombed into ash. Soldiers were dying by the thousands. Supplies were gone. But in Hitler's underground bunker, deep below the Reich Chancellery, the leadership pretended victory was still possible. And one of the reasons they could hold on to that fantasy was because many of them were still high. Other top Nazi officials had joined the spiral. Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, was consuming sleeping pills nightly. He had 6 children. By 1945, he knew what was coming, and yet he spent his final days praising Hitler, while secretly preparing to poison his own family. Heinrich. Himmler, the head of the SS, was relying on stimulants to maintain control over his collapsing empire of terror, but even he began searching for backdoor deals with the Allies, sensing the end was near. Inside the bunker, madness ruled. There were arguments, backstabbing, desperate escape attempts. Some fled Berlin, others stayed behind out of loyalty or fear. The Nazi dream was gone. Only the delusion remained, and yet, it's important to understand, drugs didn't create the horror. The hatred, the ideology, the death camps, all of that was rooted in the Nazi worldview. A worldview built on racism, anti-Semitism, domination, and control. But drugs, especially methamphetamine, amplified that horror. They didn't plant the seed, but they watered it, grew it, accelerated it. Methamphetamine didn't cause World War II, but it fueled the violence. It boosted aggression, removed empathy, suppressed exhaustion, and pushed already brutal men to commit crimes with shocking energy and endurance. The war was waged by men who believed in death, and meth gave them the stamina to carry it out longer, harder, and with less remorse. When the war ended, the world began to uncover the full scale of Nazi drug use. Millions of tablets had been produced. Medical records, survivor testimonies, and captured Nazi documents confirmed the truth. Entire segments of the army, the SS, and the leadership were chemically enhanced and emotionally deadened. But the story doesn't stop in 1945. Pervitin didn't disappear. In the 1950s and 60s, it was rebranded and sold in the United States under the name Obitrol, a pill marketed as an energy booster and weight loss aid. Later, the formula was slightly altered and became something even more familiar: Adderall. While today's Adderall is chemically different and carefully controlled, the lineage traces back to Nazi meth. Amphetamine-based stimulants that began in Hitler's Germany still exist, in boardrooms, classrooms, and doctors' offices around the world. And it wasn't just the pills that survived. Some of the scientists who experimented on prisoners in the camps, who administered meth in torture tests, never faced punishment. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union began recruiting former Nazi researchers. Through Operation Paperclip, these men were brought in to help with military medicine, aerospace programs, and experimental science. Their expertise in drugs, gleaned through unspeakable cruelty, wasn't buried. It was repurposed. So what does this all mean today? It means that drugs are not inherently evil. They can heal, they can help, but in the wrong hands, for the wrong purpose, they become tools of destruction. In Nazi Germany, meth wasn't used to treat illness. It was used to create fearless killers, numb executioners, and a delusional leadership clinging to power through a haze of injections. When you mix radical ideology with drugs that remove emotion, fear, or conscience, what you get is a machine capable of mass genocide. And the scariest part? It all started with a little white pill that looked completely harmless.